The Government Communications Security Bureau and related legislation bill has hit the headlines over the last few weeks. The government is hurriedly pushing the bill through Parliament, while thousands of people in 10 centres nationwide protested against it over the weekend. Joining me tonight to explain the bill and why it's so controversial is political scientist Dr. Bryce Edwards. Good evening.
Hi, Rebecca.
What is the GCSB Bill?
Well, the GCSB itself is one of the agencies of the state which is concerned with national security. So you've got the SIS on one hand, which is your traditional part of the state that does the spying, on the ground, following us around or whatever, whereas the GCSB are the electronic part of it. These are the ones that have the Waihopai dish and they intercept various electronic parts of the communication. So they're not wandering around the streets. And so this bill is trying to clarify the relationship between those two agencies, and in particular whether the GCSB can spy on us, because traditionally the SIS is the one that can spy on New Zealanders. The GCSB is only for looking outwards, outside of New Zealand, looking at foreigners and what they might be doing in terms of our national security.
Now that sounds pretty straightforward, so why is this bill so controversial?
Well, it's controversial because in clarifying the nature of that, the bill is actually giving more powers to the GCSB. So whereas we used to have that split, the new bill clarifies it by saying, well, actually the GCSB can spy on New Zealanders if the SIS has a warrant and asks them to, or a few other government departments, in fact. And so it changes that traditional relationship. And there's also a lot of doubts about whether there's good enough oversight of the GCSB. So whether there's, because we've found from some of the controversies later, the Kim.com scenario, that it's been running amok to some degree. It's a bit of an old-fashioned agency with some old-fashioned people running it, and it hasn't really been following procedures. So people are concerned that it's a bit out of control and that this legislation doesn't really bring it, properly under the firm control of the public service, essentially.
What sort of data is the GCSB looking for?
Well, like I said, it's an electronic-orientated agency, so it's emails, texts, telephone calls, and those sort of things that are a big part of the modern world, because when it was set up, it was really only telephone calls, but everything is electronic these days. So what we're doing online falls under their ambit.
How do we know we're not being spied on already?
Well, we can't really be too sure. Like I said, with the SIS, they're allowed to. So, there's no real questions there. But the GCSB, they haven't been allowed to. But then with the controversies that came out, we found that they were spying on New Zealanders because they thought they thought the law was ambiguous, and they thought that they were allowed to if the SIS asked them to. And so we found that last year 88 New Zealanders had been spied upon by the GCSB, and at this stage there's a bit of a curfew on it and they're not doing it at the moment. But after this law goes through, they'll have more ability to do so.
What have organisations like the Law Society and the Human Rights Commission said about the bill?
Yeah, well, it's not just your sort of radicals that are protesting about this. It's not, the fringe dwellers. It's actually some quite sort of establishment organisations like the Human Rights Commission, the Law Society, that are saying, hang on a minute, we're not sure about whether it's a good thing to allow the GCSB to have more powers, and we're not sure about whether there's enough oversight and good enough controls on it, but B, the process by which you're doing it is a bit dodgy. You're rushing this through, you're not really consulting properly, and you're making a bit of a mess of the legislation.
When will the bill be passed?
Probably this next month in August, because bills have 3 readings. It's had the first reading. The government will need a majority in the House to pass it. So they've got 61 votes out of the 121 MPs, which is just a majority of 1, because Peter Dunn has agreed to vote for it. So it looks like it probably will pass.
Political scientist Dr. Bryce Edwards, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Rebecca.